this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or
The
news.
single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget.
Today I'm having a conversation with Susan Scott. Susan is the award-winning author of the books Fierce Conversations, Achieving Success at Work and in Life, One Conversation at a Time, and Fierce Leadership, an alternative to the worst best practices of business today. Susan, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. It is a joy to spend time with someone with whom I share a wheelhouse. You know, I don't have to convince you how important conversations are. It's great.
No, absolutely not. No, when I read the book, I was smiling the whole time, writing down all these great notes and saying, yep, I like that, I like that, I like that. So two kindred spirits, clearly.
Absolutely. And I'm always happy when somebody shows me their copy of the book and it looks like a truck has run over it several times because they've folded down so many corners and made so many notes. I mean, that makes me very happy. I'm sure that you feel the same way about your book.
I do.
Yeah.
Hopefully you can see in the background behind my head, I've got all my little stickers on your book.
Love it.
Also reading the book, I also was looking at some of the past interviews you've done, your TEDx talk and some other things. And I'd like to start with your background because I found you have a rather circuitous path that's quite interesting. And maybe circuitous isn't the right word, but I think we could probably agree it's not a straight path from your college degree to where you are now.
No, I mean, I say in the book, life is curly. Don't try to straighten it out. I was absolutely not qualified by most people's standards to come in and chair two groups of CEOs. I was an English major. I taught high school English, speech, drama, Shakespeare, poetry, composition, all of that stuff, and I loved it. And then we moved to Seattle, where I am now, and then I went to work for a headhunting firm and eventually became the VP of that, which was my introduction to business. And I remember having to say to clients, you need to educate me because I'll go find you one of those. But first you have to tell me what it is. Where might such an exotic creature live? But I learned a lot about business. But then when I was invited to chair these groups of CEOs, I went in there with sort of my knees trembling because there were 15 members in each of these groups, non-competing members, everything from software to coffee to manufacturing to you name it. I had this 50-yard line seat on some fascinating lives and fascinating companies. And every month, each group would spend one whole day together to advise one another on their most pressing issues. And then once a month, I would spend 2 hours with each of them one-to-one to say, what is the most important thing you and I should be talking about? And then I would determine whether that should go to the group. Well, I didn't know how to do any of that. The thing that's funny about human nature is when somebody sits down in front of you and just listens, people love that. I would walk in the door and they would just start talking. And I didn't have to say much or ask much. And then I'd make a few notes about what they said they were going to do, and the next month I'd follow up. Well, how did this go? How did that? And it was only when, and I wrote about it in the book, you may recall, one of my guys withheld some really troubling stuff that was going on with his company. And when he finally disclosed it, it was too late to turn it around. And I was devastated. And so were the other members of the group. And I thought, okay, what I have been doing doesn't cut it. not even close, So much can change in the life of a CEO, all of us. So much can change in 30 days. What was important to me 30 days ago, I don't even remember that because now something else is so much more important. So that's why I developed that coaching conversation that begins with, given everything that is on your plate, what is the most important thing we should be talking about? Because I wanted to make sure we covered that in depth before we would move on to other topics. But, really, honestly, Clint, I don't know that they would hire me today if they looked at what my resume was back then. I mean, they want people with MBAs and, all this experience running companies and being CEOs or owners. And I wasn't any of those things. But what I was I had genuine affection for the CEOs that were in my groups. I cared deeply about them. I was fascinated by what they did. I felt so lucky to get to wander around in their companies with them and learn how things work,
Right.
And I just got really good at asking questions, the right questions.
I remember, I think there was a time in the book you mentioned sitting on the floor, crossing your legs, and I think Bill Gates might have been in the room, or it was his company or something
He had
early
just
on.
moved. Bill Gates had just moved to Bellevue, Washington from California. I didn't know Bill Gates from Adam, but we just got this call and I went over. There was no furniture. I kicked off my high heels, sat on the floor. We ordered pizza. He had maybe 12 employees.
Wow.
And they started saying, here's what we need. And that for sure is when I said, okay, you're going to really have to educate me. I have no idea what that is, but I'm a quick learner. And I probably placed the first 100 people at Microsoft until they were growing so fast, so big that they took it inside, which made all the sense in the world. But what a kick that was.
Right. I remember when I hired my first HR director to go out, and we were growing at the time. And so we were trying to recruit people, and she goes, Clint, who am I looking for? I said, Stacy, it's easy. We look for engineers with social skills, willing to travel 3 weeks a month on the road. Good luck with that.
Good luck with that. Yeah. Oh boy.
Yeah. So there's a reason we're a small company.
Yeah.
Early in Fierce Conversations, you said something that really resonated with me, so much so that I actually had to pause and read it again. It really gets straight to, I think, the heart of the matter. And you said, and I quote, our careers, our companies, our relationships, and indeed our very lives succeed or fail gradually, then suddenly, one conversation at a time. What a simple yet truly compelling truism.
Clint, that was inspired by reading Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. That's the English major in me. I typically read novels.
That was a theme I noticed throughout the book. You're reading other books while you're writing this book.
Oh, yeah. So. And the book I'm almost finished with now has lots of passages from novels that I have read. But anyway, I was reading The Sun Also Rises, in which a character is asked, how did you go bankrupt? And he responds, gradually and then suddenly. And I laughed. And then I just had this, I want to say epiphany, but my niece calls them apostrophes. She called me one day, I've had an apostrophe, and she meant epiphany, but I love the idea of having an apostrophe. So I had this apostrophe that, given the, 10,000 plus hours of conversations and observations of the leaders that I worked with, and I also worked with their executive teams, it was really clear that if they hit a bad patch, let's say they lost a key customer, how did they lose that key customer that counted for 25% of their net profit? They lost that customer one failed or one missing conversation at a time. How did they gain a customer that their competition would kill for? One fabulous, amazing conversation at a time. And it went on and on and on. And even personally, because I was so privileged that they shared a lot with me from their personal lives. And once in a while, I'd be with a devastated human being who was wondering, how did I manage to lose, an 18-year marriage that I was not prepared to lose? I lost that marriage, one failed, one missing conversation at a time. So how am I going to get from here to there, wherever I want there to be? Same way I got here, one conversation at a time, but we're not very good at it. And I've often said, look, we're going to disagree. We just need to do it better. We just don't know how to have these conversations. And we don't even know how to tell people what we appreciate about them in a way that lands with them. We just say, good job, attaboy, thanks, you're awesome. That doesn't land. It just doesn't. Nobody taught me how to have conversations that get great results, conversations that interrogate reality and provoke learning and tackle tough challenges and enrich relationships. Nobody taught me how to do that.
Right. You mentioned missing conversations, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later on, but I'm reminded that one of the things that we're missing today is, since we're all remote, there's these organic conversations that happen when you run into somebody on the way to get coffee or at Starbucks. They're not happening, and that's a missing conversation.
Yeah, it is. We have a culture committee. Well, we're remote. We went remote and decided to stay remote, which is really, really hard for some of our employees, especially the younger ones, because they formed really close friendships and did exactly what you're talking about. They do crossword puzzles together on break, or they would just talk about their weekends. And all of a sudden we're not in the same space. But we have a culture committee who was tasked with how do you help us stay connected? And they've done an amazing job. I mean, they've worked really, really hard. So our Zoom meetings, but we have those, of course, but we also have times where we're just playing some kind of game or having happy hour together, or we're put into small groups and given a question or a topic to discuss together. And that's been really helpful.
Good. We may have to come back to that one as well. So I've always learned, and this is dangerous talking to an English major, but I've always felt that semantics matter. So I'd like to get your definition of a fierce conversation, because they sound mean and painful, and it's like something I'd like to avoid.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it sounds like, I'm going to tell you what I think of you and the horse you rode in on. And of course, it's not that at all, or nobody would ever want to have them. So the simplest definition of a fierce conversation is one in which we come out from behind ourselves into our conversations and make them real. They are courageous, they are robust, they are passionate, but most importantly, they are real. And, people like to think that they are real, but I have seen so many times somebody, telling me or somebody else, a colleague, here's what I think of our plan, our strategy. It's not that great. I'm not sure it's going to work because of this. And then their boss comes into the room and they reverse positions. Oh, this is a great plan. I'm so excited. We do that. And it's just in the way of success, because if we don't really interrogate reality, if we don't know what's actually happening on the ground, then how in the world can we make the best decisions? And we need to make those decisions, because Carl Jung said, what we do not make conscious emerges later as fate.
Right.
So we've got to get it out on the table and look at it, whether we like it or not.
You have so many great sayings. I could fill a whole hour up with just pulling quotes from the book, and just, you wouldn't have to say a word. I would just say, and she said, and just list them all. Because I took pages and pages of notes of these quotes. It was awesome.
You can do that. Go ahead.
As an engineer, I'm a big fan of formulas, and you have one in the book that says conversation equals relationship.
Yeah.
And you tell a wonderful story about an English poet, I believe, that reinforces the formula. Can you share that with the listeners?
You bet. I was at a conference in San Diego with about, 300 of my colleagues from all over the world, other people who were chairing these groups of CEOs and managing directors. And David Whyte, spelled Whyte, a poet from Yorkshire, England, which is one of my favorite parts of the world. I have walked every inch of it and found some glorious pubs. David said, as our keynote speaker, the young man who's newly married is often really perplexed, even a little annoyed, because this lovely person to whom he has plighted his troth, and that's how they talk in England, insists on appearing before his face on a regular basis, wanting to talk yet again about the thing we just talked about last weekend. And it has something to do with the quality of our relationship. And he wonders, why are we having this conversation again? Could we have just one huge conversation about our relationship and then coast for a year or two?
Right.
But here she is again. And David said, long about age 42, and he smiled because he was 42 at that time. If he has been paying attention, it dawns on him, this robust conversation that I have been having with my wife is not about the relationship. The conversation is the relationship. And I swear, Clint, you could have heard a pin drop in that huge hall. I mean, everybody, just like I did, put it together in a way that we never had before. And if that notion that the conversation is the relationship, if that lands with anybody who's listening to this podcast, then if the conversation stops, well, you can do the math. Or if you and I add another topic to the list of things we can't talk about because it wrecks another meeting, it wrecks another weekend, then all of the possibilities for the relationship become smaller, and the possibilities for the individuals in the relationship become smaller, until one day I recognize I am making myself quite small. I am behaving as if I'm just the space around my shoes. I am engaged in yet another 3-minute conversation that is so empty of meaning it crackles. And the thing is, our most valuable currency is not money. It's not even, multiple degrees. It's not fluency in 6 languages. It's not any of that. Our most valuable currency is relationship, emotional capital, without which we can't get anything done. And we won't have very much fun either. So if we realize that every single conversation I have with someone is either enriching the relationship, flatlining it, so what's the point, or taking it down.
Well, I'm a big fan of conversation. So
Yeah.
I think for me, at least, one of the things to get people to understand is communication is not the same thing as conversation.
It isn't. I'm so glad you pointed that out. Would you say a little bit about that? Because I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, when I was writing my most recent book, I have a chapter called Communicate Like a Person, Not an Emoji. I thought they were the same thing, and I looked at the definition, and communication is actually the act of communicating information. It can be in one direction. It can also be an exchange, but it can also be one direction, like an email or a text message or leaving somebody a voicemail.
Yeah.
Whereas conversation is the oral exchange of ideas. And the key word to me is exchange.
Yeah.
So it's I listen, I talk, I listen, I talk. So it's an exchange of information. To me, it's a way of getting clarifying answers. So in my world, one of the things that always happens is people get confused. And I know you have something that we're going to talk about here in a second as well. But if you ever played the game called Telephone when you were a kid?
Yes, right. I remember.
So we know that the fun of the story is that person number one who gets the whispered thing in their ear, they communicate to the next person, and by 5 people later, it's not remotely close to what was said to the first person.
Yeah.
And that's because, and you can make the argument, there is communication going on between those 5 people. But what they're not doing is having a conversation.
And also one of our big ideas, I think, is that all conversations are with myself. And sometimes they involve other people. In other words, it's my context that is interpreting every single thing that I hear. In The Wizard of Oz, when the little dog, Toto, towards the end, he pulls the curtain back, and here's this little man who's pulling all these levers and creating all these sound effects. And then he looks at Dorothy and he says, "Pay no attention to the little man." Well, we all have a little man who's pulling the levers and putting interpretations. And I don't know what it is about human nature, but we tend to put the worst possible interpretation on things that people say or that, in an email, rather than the most positive. We make up stories about people, and then we behave as if our stories are true.
I think another thing that as an engineer, I'm always looking for foundational truths that I can build upon. And one that you mentioned that seems to transcend gender, socioeconomics, cultural bias, is that as part of the human condition, we behave emotionally first and rationally second. Yeah,
that actually, Daniel Kahneman, a psychology professor at Princeton, won the Nobel Prize for that discovery. And but get this, it was the Nobel Prize for economics. Now, why would a psychologist get the Nobel Prize for economics? Because it has such an effect on everything that we buy and sell. And he said, human beings make decisions and act first for emotional reasons, second for rational reasons. That's not a girl thing. That's not like, as you pointed out, it's the human condition. And so, I remember hearing when I was growing up, emotions don't have any place in the workplace. And what a ridiculous idea that is now looking back, because if we don't bring all of ourselves in, then we're just an automaton and not really fully engaged. So emotions give the lit match something to ignite. Without it, we can have people nodding their head and saying, yeah, but they're in no danger of doing anything.
In the book, you mentioned connecting with others is something that's important. And I was wondering, do you feel we can accomplish that through social media?
Oof, I have a Facebook page. I do, but I don't spend any time there. There are people who do that for me, because I don't want to go look at a screen. I know that sounds horrible. There's a lot of people who love to spend time on Facebook, but I just don't. I don't even visit LinkedIn very often, all these other things. And I don't have accounts for many of the, Twitter and Instagram and all those things. I just don't, because I don't feel a need for them. That doesn't mean that I'm right or wrong. I just don't. I did say, and I mean, if you want to become a great leader, a great human being, you must gain the capacity to connect with the people who are important to you at a deep level, or lower your aim. And it is that deeper connection where you cross the line between, hi, how are you? Fine, good, to someplace so much more interesting. And that does require a conversation, I think. Because, and part of it is social media. I mean, I've just had an email exchange lately with a very, very old friend. I just love her to pieces, but she definitely took something that I wrote to her in the absolutely opposite direction of what I was thinking or what I intended. So I had to waste an awful lot of time, hers and mine, to call her and say, hey, I don't know how you got there, but I wasn't there with you. So, we do need to talk. We need to hear each other's voices. Zoom, boy, don't I wish I had invested in Zoom before the pandemic, and plexiglass, let's see, and so many other things.
So many other things.
Yeah.
I think with social media, it gets back to the thing we were just talking about. It's social media to me lends itself to communication, and it's a little tougher for conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you can make the argument that you text me and I text back and we're having a conversation, but to your point, it's really disjointed. And wouldn't it be easier to pick up the phone and say, hey, let's have a 2-minute conversation that's going to replace 37 text messages back and forth?
Totally would, but I got to admit, Clint, the only way I can communicate with my granddaughters is by text. So
know your audience.
We text one another. That's that audience. Yeah. But
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I open the podcast each week with a George Bernard Shaw quote that says, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
I know. I love that.
So you can imagine the smile on my face when I read, one of the most common outcomes of conversation is miscommunication, because all conversations are with myself and sometimes involve other people.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that a little? Well,
it harkens back to what I said a little bit earlier about how we say something, and whoever is on the receiving end of what we say it's going to pass through their context, their filter. And we've spent a lifetime creating that filter through which we apprehend everything. It consists of all of our opinions and attitudes and beliefs. And sometimes those beliefs become capital T truths for us. So I'm going to lay that on what you said. And sometimes that's accurate and sometimes that isn't. But I think what we don't realize is how important our context is, our beliefs. Our beliefs cause us to behave the way we behave. Our behavior produces our results. So I'm always saying to friends, family, and clients, look, if you're not happy with the result in this area of your life or your company or your team or whatever it is, what beliefs do you hold about that person or persons that may be in the way? And see if you can choose a different belief. It's not easy to do, but at some point we have to realize, look, everything my mother told me was not necessarily accurate. Even some of the things I learned in church are not serving me a whole bunch today. I really need to think for myself.
Yeah, it's always a good idea.
Yeah.
Another thing that I read that really had me mentally high-fiving you was, there are not enough emojis in the world to ensure that your emails and text are heard in the way you intend, which is what you were just talking about. So you've kind of answered the question, which is, why do you feel that way? And I was going to mention that not everybody agrees with us, right? Because I read an article in Inc. magazine recently that lauded the adoption of emojis in business as something that was vital. And I just cringed, because I'm like you. I think that the tone of an email is so easily misinterpreted, and you don't make up for it by a thumbs up. Because I've actually had somebody tell me that somebody they sent a thumbs up to thought it was the middle finger.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No. Well, I will say that I have to admit that I do use emojis from time to time because of experiences like this, where somebody sent me something that they were working on and I emailed back, good job. And then when I heard from them, well, clearly you don't like the work that I did. And I thought, where did it say that? Maybe they were feeling a little insecure about what they did. I don't know, but it's like, oh. So if I'm really, really happy, but I don't want to write a long email, I might put an emoji there that's jumping up for joy or something, or just to be funny. There's some funny ones out there. I try not to use them too much, but sometimes, because we will interpret words on a page, we don't have tone of voice. You're not sitting in front of me. I don't see the expression on your face. Boy, can we go south.
Yeah, for sure. But I've also had the situation where people can use an emoji to hide behind what's really happening. So
That's right. That's right.
I think it comes back to this conversation just is so important that we have to have it.
Yeah.
So I love how, by the way, you use these questions that just cut right to the chase. For instance, one of the questions you like to ask is, what are you pretending not to know? Right?
Yeah.
Kind of the opposite of the squishy emojis is these laser focused boom.
Yeah. Somebody asked me that when I was in my early 30s, and I didn't even understand the question at first. And then I thought about it and I thought, man, that's good. That's really, really, really good. And also one of the things that we teach is how to run a great meeting. And one of the things that's important to say to everybody in the room is, look, I want to hear from every single one of you. And I am inviting you to push back against my ideas. And I mean that sincerely. And if you don't say anything, I will call on you. And if you call on someone and they say, I don't have any, I don't really know. I don't know. Then it's important to say, well, what would it be if you did know? Or if someone says, well, I don't have anything to add because Stephanie pretty much said what I would say, then you have to say, well, what would you add if you did have something to add? Because we're teaching the people in the room, you don't get to come in here and shrink your subatomic particles and play solitaire under the table. You need to lean in, pay attention, and think about everything that's being explored here in this meeting and have an opinion.
I was going to bring that up later. So what are the typical responses you get when you won't let people off the hook?
Oh, they squirm. They squirm. I was working with a very large oil company, and I took the CEO and his direct reports and his assistant on a retreat every 2 months to work on some of the things they really needed to work on. And I remember one of the issues, I told the assistant, because she was right there in the room, I said, I want to hear from you as well. And we heard from everybody else, and then we got to her, and I said, so what are your thoughts? And she said, oh, I don't, this is, I can't weigh in on this. I don't know. And I said, you know more than a lot of people in this room. You're sitting at the crossroads where everything happens. You know a lot. What is your thought about what you've heard so far? And I could see that all the guys in the room, and they were all guys, they wanted to rescue her because she was very uncomfortable.
I'm sure.
They really wanted to come in and rescue her. And I just sort of held up my hand, no, stop, and waited. And then she said, well, you're not going to like this, guys, but I don't think we're talking about the real issue. I think the real issue is, and she laid it out. She nailed it. Everybody was stunned.
Right.
They had so much respect for her going forward, and she never laid low after that. So, you have to let somebody be uncomfortable, because there's gold in them thar uncomfortable hills. And we teach people how to behave. We teach people how to treat us. We teach people how to interact in a meeting, and we get what we tolerate. So if we continually tolerate stuff that isn't helpful or useful, well, at some point you kind of deserve what you get because you're tolerating.
Well, that actually segues nicely into my next question, which is, there are 7 principles in the book, and one of them you lay out is master the courage to interrogate reality.
Yeah.
And one of the things you mentioned there that I think is desperately needed today is the ability to describe reality from your perspective without laying blame.
Yes.
Now that sounds great. And I was wondering, how do we do that? How do you pull that off?
It's hard, but it's worth the struggle to do it. So let me just back up a tiny bit and say that the very first sentence in the book is, no plan survives its collision with reality. And reality has an irritating habit of changing, which seriously complicates our fantasies about how things were going to go. Well, here we are, in COVID. Boy, did our reality get messed with big time. But so we do need to hear from people who have competing perspectives. But as soon as somebody starts saying, well, I mean, I hate to say this, but you guys in sales are just not blah, 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 blah. Or you guys, the marketing department isn't supporting us with really great stuff, or this or that. No, and nobody wants to hear that, even if it's true. Nobody wants to hear that. And so we have to think of, how do I get at that without pointing the finger? And I could say, I'm not sure that I have done what I've needed to do to clarify exactly the kinds of collaborations that we need from one another. And I think we can do better. Jane, you're in sales, and I know sometimes we butt heads. What are your thoughts about this? Just that way. I mean, because one of the objectives of a fierce conversation or a meeting is to enrich relationships. And I'm sure as heck not going to enrich it by saying you are a pain in the butt, or you're not doing your job, or you're failing, or you're causing me grief, or you are the reason why I am not successful, So you just have to really be thoughtful about it. What is reality from where I sit, and where's my DNA here? Because it's probably there somewhere. My fingerprints are on this too. And if I own up to that, because if I don't own up to that, everybody else is thinking it. So I might as well own up to that and say, man, this is what I recognize, from my side, that where I have fallen short, and I want to do better. I want us to do better. I want us to collaborate better. What are your suggestions? What's your experience? That goes over really well.
You may have just answered this question as well, but I grew up in the South and was raised under the golden rule: if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. And on the other hand, I've been in relationships with people that wield honesty like a sword and as a way to inflict pain.
Yeah. And
so how do you navigate between the make nice, be polite, non-confrontational approach, and the other extreme is where the truth is weaponized?
Yeah, I got it. By the way, I grew up in Tennessee, so
okay.
I'm a Southern girl too.
So you know about the bless your heart culture then?
Bless your heart. Yeah, no, I think she's doing a little drinking. Bless her heart.
Exactly.
I can't remember who said it. Some wonderful, funny actress said, if you can't say something nice about anybody, sit by me. Wanted the gossip.
I'm always reminded of the Hee Haw episode where they say, you'll never hear us repeating gossip, so you better be sure and listen close the first time.
Exactly. So I have intervened in meetings that I'm helping to facilitate, or I'm just a member of the team, or in one-to-one conversations, professional ones, personal ones, even conversations with clients where someone is throwing darts, feels what it feels like. And I have said, I don't even know how many times I've said, hang on, I'd like you to find another way to talk with me, because this is not pleasant.
Right.
Again, we teach people how to treat us. I'd like you to find another way to talk with me. And in a meeting, if somebody's blaming, you can stop them and say, hey, I want you to think about the damage that you're doing here right now. You want to be helpful. I absolutely know that. And the way you are delivering your message is leaving a very negative wake. We always leave a wake. There is, especially for a leader, there is no trivial comment. Something you don't even remember saying years ago, somebody is still devastated, or somebody is still grateful to you to this day. You don't even remember saying it. So do you want your wake to be an aftermath, an aftertaste, or do you want it to be an afterglow? And I do think, honestly, I got feedback early in my leadership days. Your message is on point, but your delivery leaves a lot to be desired. And I remember thinking, well, if I'm too strong for some people, that's their problem. And it took a while for me to realize, no, actually, that is my problem. My delivery does leave something to be desired. How do I get at the truth without doing damage, remaining respectful? And it's not easy. And that is not to say that you are never, ever going to say something that is going to upset somebody. You might.
Right.
We have to stop beating around the bush. We need to go straight for the issue. We need to stop having these careful. So a lot of our clients have come to us in part because they have a culture of nice. Death by nice, we are going to die because we are so nice to one another. We are so careful. We don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. We don't want, blah, blah, blah. I think a careful conversation is almost always a failed conversation because it just postpones the conversation that wants and needs to take place. If I have to deliver a message that I know is going to hurt, I will say, this is going to hurt a little. And I hold you able to know where this is coming from me, this place of affection and respect. And this is going to be a conversation, not just me pointing something out to you. So this is what I want to talk with you about, and go there. Because honestly, sometimes what we don't talk about is killing us.
Yeah. And I think if you don't talk about it now, you're going to pay interest on it later.
Absolutely. Well, back to Carl Jung, What we don't make conscious emerges later as fate. So
Exactly.
the bottom line is that what gets talked about in a company, within a team, within a family, what gets talked about and how it gets talked about absolutely determines what's going to happen and what's not going to happen.
Well, that wraps up part 1 of my conversation with Susan Scott, author of Fierce Conversations, Achieving Success at Work and in Life, One Conversation at a Time, and Fierce Leadership, an alternative to the worst best practices of business today. Coming up in part 2, we'll discuss how Robert Redford sets the standard for radical transparency.
You know, who's wonderful at meetings like this is Robert Redford, the actor. Depending on the topic, he will invite quite a motley crew into the room, not just the usual suspects, but whose perspective would be useful. And he kicks off his meetings saying, you know, I'm going to tell you what I think and why I think it. And if I had to make a decision today without your input, I'm going to tell you what decision I would make and why. Now, your value here is to tell me what I'm missing, push back. And what are you seeing that I'm not seeing? What would you suggest that I haven't thought of? And if we get this right, I will be different when this conversation is over. I've never heard another leader say anything like that. I will be different when this conversation is over. I am inviting you to influence me.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at Amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.